Touche, pussycat.
Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Touche 2, Castlehaven's Delight. Yeah! All right, guys, have fun. You didn't think I was done with Mervyn Touche, did you? Because there's so much more to this story than just the sensationalism and the media manipulation of the masses, right? This is a story of high strangeness among the upper echelons of the royal bloodlines, right? So we're going to start this one out with a little background on who Mervyn Touche was, and that starts with his title of Baron Audley, right, which is a bloodline barony that can trace its origins all the way back to King Edward I and his Ninth Crusade occupation of Acre in the Holy Land. And this can be done through his granddaughter, Margaret de Clare, right? And who marries the first Baron Audley. Right? So Hugh here, not only being the first Baron Audley, he's also the first Earl of Gloucester, right? And we've seen how important the name Gloucester is in this Mud City story so far, right? And, on his mother's side, he's a Roos. And he serves for a time as Sheriff of Rutland, so perhaps tying him in with the Manners family and the Dukes of Rutland. And his sister marries the first Earl of Greystoke, right? So add Tarzan to the list of characters that this Poe story touches on, right? It's unbelievable the way this works, right? And so as I was saying, he marries Margaret de Clare, who is King Edward I's granddaughter, and this is where we really start to see the name Clare, and this name only becomes more important as we go along because of its importance not only to Ireland, but also to the Carrolls as well. But the barony of Audley doesn't stay with the Audley name for very long because the Audleys run out of male heirs, and the barony transfers over to the third Baron's sister, Joanne Audley, who is married to this one Sir John Touche, right? And so he is somehow styled the fourth Baron, but really the bloodline barony picks up with their eldest son, and that's how the barony comes to the Touches. And it starts a trend that follows the Baron Audleys from not only the beginning with the Audleys, but it ends, as far as this story is concerned, over 300 years later with Mervyn's son James. And that's the trend of inherited wealth and influence through marriage. The Baron Audleys always seem to marry up and reap huge windfalls because of it. It's a trend that's so curious to me that it has me wondering if this whole Audley Touche story isn't just a giant smokescreen for the preservation of certain bloodlines and the consolidation of their assets. And that crazy Mervyn Touche was going to screw it all up with his buggery, right? And so we're going to pick this story up when Marvyn is 15 years old and his father signs over all his English properties to him because his father, George, right? George has been created first Earl of Castlehaven, right? Which is in the peerage of Ireland. And so Georgie here, he leaves all his English properties to his 15-year-old son, including the estate at Fonthill Gifford, which is actually from his mother's side of the family. But, he gets so propertied up that he's knighted at the age of 15. And when he turns 18, he enters law school at the Middle Temple, right? This familiar theme, again, all these people going to law school and earning these degrees and never really doing anything with them professionally. And this degree doesn't actually serve him very, very well at all, being convicted and beheaded the way that he was, right? But, at 18, he also marries his first wife, this Elizabeth Barnum. And I have a picture of her here, right? And I think this picture is really amazing because she's holding this blanket, which appears like it could be swaddling a baby, maybe, but it's empty, right? And this is a really interesting sort of clue to this story. And it also makes me kind of wonder if this actually isn't a painting of Mervyn Touche's second wife, the Lady Anne Stanley. And we're going to talk about her coming up, but a really amazing, amazing painting given the way this story goes. All right. And, and she's an heiress in her own right, this Elizabeth Barnum, right? She, through this marriage, like the Touche gains properties in Middlesex, Hampshire, Kent, Essex, so continuing that trend of inherited wealth, right? And not only that, her sister is married to Francis Bacon. That's right. Old Top Hat himself. As I was saying, things were going really well for Mervyn Touche. But this is where the story starts to get really strange, right? Because roughly a year after the marriage ceremony in 1612, right, the couple's first son, James, was baptized. Right? It doesn't say born, it says baptized, which is really interesting because Wiki says that James Touche was born circa 1617. That's like 5 years later. And that could play an important part of the story down the line. Right? Especially because Mervyn's father dies that same year, and Mervyn inherits all the property in Ireland and the title of Earl of Castlehaven, becoming the second Earl of Castlehaven. Right? So there could be something more than coincidence to these birth and death dates. Who knows? Further tragedy strikes just a few years later when his wife Elizabeth dies in 1622, leaving him a widower with 6 kids. But fear not, Mervyn is still a dashing young nobleman of just 29 years old, right? And he has no trouble finding a new wife, remarrying in 1624 to this lady Anne Bridges, whose maiden name was Stanley. And she's an heiress twice over herself, being a widow of one Baron Chandos, right, who I didn't really look into for this story, but she's the eldest daughter of Ferdinand Stanley. Now, he's another top hat, right? And believe it or not, Stanley here was next in line for the crown after Elizabeth in the succession set up by Henry VIII. Right? So if he outlives Elizabeth, he becomes king, right? And having no male heirs, that would make the Lady Anne the woman who would be queen. But that doesn't happen because it's alleged that he was poisoned to make room for King James of Scotland, thus unifying the crowns, right? And so Mervyn Touche here, seemingly marrying up, right, and gaining all of this property and influence. And one thing to note about this union is that she is significantly older than him by about 13 years. Right? She's like 44 when they get married, and he's probably 31. Right? And she brings her own brood of children with her from her first marriage to the Baron Chandos, right? And so it makes quite the Touche Bridges Brady bunch. And so once again, things really looking up for Mervyn Touche, right? The Baron Audley, the Earl of Castlehaven. So good, in fact, that in 1628, he actually marries his eldest son to Anne's eldest daughter, further consolidating and strengthening their empire. It's really kind of unbelievable, right? So on the surface, everything seems to be going magnificently, right? But 2 years later, in 1630, that's when the complaint of buggery is charged against him, right? And it's none other than his own eldest son and heir who levies that charge against him. On November 1st, 1630, James writes a letter to King Charles I remonstrating Castlehaven for parental unkindness, right? Claiming it was his father's uxoriousness with his favorite servants, which led to the complaint. And as I mentioned, 2 of his favorite servants were tried, convicted, and executed as well in this trial. But the story is bigger than that, and about to get a whole lot stranger, because there are actually 4 servants at the heart of this story. And so before we go any further, let's meet them real quick, right? And so we have Henry Skipworth, Giles Browning, nay Broadway. We have Florentius Fitzpatrick, sometimes called Lawrence, or I call him Larry, right? And the singularly named Anthill, whose name literally means anthill, and since he had no other name in the story, that's why his picture's an anthill, right? And so the book on Mervyn is that, he's a very generous man who's prone to taking in wayward, vagrant, homeless types, as servants, right? And that's a very common thing for him to do, right? And but the trouble seems to begin when in 1621, he brings Henry Skipworth over from Ireland to be page to Lady Anne. This is kind of interesting because that doesn't necessarily make him Irish. With the Touches being from England and having so much property over in Ireland, he could have been a servant of his father's. There's just no way to know, but the other problem is that in 1621, Lady Anne was not at Fonthill Gifford because she doesn't show up on the scene until 1624. Right? In 1621, Mervyn's first wife, Elizabeth, is still alive. So kind of very curious that they say he was brought over to be page to Lady Anne in 1621. But the problems really start to arise when, Skipworth is welcome at the family's table and was to be addressed as Mr. Skipworth by the servants. Right? And that's several years later, Giles Broadway arrived at the house and received similar treatment. All right? So these 2 guys show up, as servants, and pretty soon they're sitting at the family table. Right? On the surface, that seems strange enough, right? Servants at the family table and having to be addressed formally, right? So that seems really out of character for such high nobility to me, right? This is something that tipped me off that there must be more to Henry Skipworth and Giles Broadway than mere servitude and the generosity of their lord, right? Because it turns out that that generosity also happens to take a financial form as well, because he gives Skipworth an estate in Salisbury worth £260 a year. That could be as much as $50,000 today, right? And that's nothing compared to what he does for Anthill, who was another one of these beggar and vagabond types, right? And Castlehaven picks him up from his good friend Sir Henry Smith and makes him his personal page, right? And he finds his services so agreeable, right, that he makes him master of the stables and gives him a salary of £500 a year compared to a yearly allowance of only £100 that he gives to his own son, James. And now, of course, given the timetable here, James is probably only a teenager, 14, 15 maybe, who knows, younger perhaps, given the wonkiness with the dates for James. All right, but even £100, in 1620, it's like $20,000 or something like that, right? It's a lot of money. Right? And James gets furious with his father when Castlehaven arranges to have Anthill marry one of his daughters from his first marriage, or, one of James's sisters, giving Anthill a dowry of £7,000. And I think that's like over $1 million today. And so it says here that Castlehaven was a kind master, though an unkind father, and a vicious husband, right? And so putting all of this together kind of got my fat sense tingling as to what was really going on here, right? And so now James's complaint of parental unkindness is starting to make a whole lot more sense, especially given that in 1629 he flees the family estate after Elizabeth becomes involved with Castlehaven's favored servant, Henry Skipworth. And this was allegedly done at the insistence of Mervyn Touche. And so now you have to keep in mind that James and Elizabeth here would be very young. They were children still. Like if James is born in 1617, he's 12 years old here, right? And Elizabeth, by all accounts, was only 12 or 13 when this incident was happening, when Castlehaven was forcing Skipworth onto her, right? But to add insult to injury, she apparently really likes this, right? And not only that, it gets way stranger because it's claimed that the crazed Earl had concocted a scheme to have Henry Skipworth impregnate the girl with his bastard, whom James would be forced to recognize as his own. When I first read that, I was like, wait, what? Because that would make this bastard child his legitimate heir, right? If James recognizes this child as his own. So I was like, what is going on here, right? Because in a time and to a people where bloodline meant everything, why would Mervyn Touche attempt to transfer his wealth and titles to the bloodline of a servant, right? It just doesn't make sense. Why create a new bloodline and keep your name, especially when your bloodline connects to King Edward I, right? And Elizabeth's bloodline connects to the very noble Stanley and Spencer families. All right, and going forward, like Winston Churchill and Lady Di were Spencers. A Touche and Stanley Spencer heir would be high nobility. So now I start to see a motive behind these charges, which they tell us come when James Touche reaches his inheritance age. James fears disinheritance, right? So that's why he brings these charges against his father. It's not that he diddles the help, right? It's that he's lost his mind because not only is he giving away estates and high-paying jobs to every vagabond he wants to bang, he's now trying to give away the whole kit and caboodle to one of them, right? It's unbelievable. These charges were brought as a way for young James to protect his heritage, right? His titles and his family fortune from the mad baron, right? And you have to remember that regardless of his age, James has advisors or people close to him that are guiding him through this whole affair, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if one of those people was his stepmother, the Lady Anne, right? Because you have to remember that she accuses Mervyn of rape herself, right? And Mervyn has to be stopped. right? He's giving everything away. So thank the crown for the buggery act of 1533, right? I mean, sure, the attention is going to suck, but if it means keeping everything in the family bloodline, and the only cost is a hit to the reputation and the lives of a couple of servants, so be it. Though not Henry Skipworth, who miraculously never stands trial or is accused of anything in this, right? Castlehaven paints the seriousness of the allegations against him in a light of greed and jealousy from his family. It's his estate that's on trial, he says, and it's his family that are trying to take it from him, right? And though the Lady Anne testifies that Touche's perversity was on full display from day one of their marriage, bringing in favorites into the marital bed and encouraging her to sleep with them, he counters that she's an insatiable vixen. And Giles Broadway, who is to stand trial as an accomplice in the attempted rape of the Lady Anne, gives testimony to back up Touche's claim. He says that one day while he and Touche were out strolling around in the garden, he said to Giles, "Thou art young, lusty, and well-favored. I am old and cannot live long, my wife wholly delighting in lust, which I am neither able nor willing to satisfy. Thou mayest do well to lie with her, and so pleasing her, after my death marry her, and thereby raise thy fortune." All right, so think about that, right? Touche here's calling himself old, yet at the time of this, he would have been like in his mid-30s, and his wife, who's wholly delighting in lust, this insatiable lust, she would have been in her late 40s, maybe even as old as 50. Right? That's an unbelievable aspect of the story. And Florentius here, Larry, he actually gives testimony at the trial backing this up as well. But of course, what good is the testimony of a servant, right? Especially one who, indulges in buggery. But he testifies that the Lady Anne is a cruel, vicious, wicked woman. One of the most evil women to ever live, I believe he says in his testimony. But of course, it does no good, and the court sides with Lady Anne and James Touche, right? All right, so it's off with Merv the Perv's head, right? I mean, that's the way this story plays out, right? But there are more bizarre pieces to this story that make me think of the bloodline craziness that Mervyn could have been up to with Henry Skipworth and his daughter-in-law, Elizabeth Bridges. And that's that, along with apparently enjoying herself being passed around among the help, Lady Anne gives birth to Skipworth's child, right? And that baby disappears. What in the hell is going on with Henry, portrait of a serial rapist and his seed? Who is Henry Skipworth? Because not only was Marvin Touche seemingly intent on transferring his legacy to the Skipworth bloodline, we cannot lose sight of the fact that the Lady Anne is royalty herself. And that so there's a missing kid out there with the blood of kings flowing in its veins. And that given the favoritism Castlehaven shows to Skipworth, I think it's safe to say that he wasn't one of the peasant class, right? So who knows what his true pedigree is? How blue is his blood compared to the Lady Anne's? There could be an unaccounted for bloodline family out there. The baby spirited away by some royal guardian, educated in who knows what, and assigned a new name. Who knows what that person or the family that they start could be capable of, right? I mean, this thing just doesn't stop, right? When I was doing my due diligence on Ampthill, not only did I learn that Ampthill means anthill, right? I also found out that it's a town in England and that Queen Aragon lived there when she got the news that Henry was done with her. A queen living in Ampthill? A coincidence? I think not, right? But seeing that Castlehaven got Ampthill, his servant, off this Henry Smith, I figure I should look him up real quick, and this is what I found. Right? I found a listing for one Henry Smith, regicide, most likely the son of the Henry Smith that Castlehaven picked up Ampthill from, but who knows? Right? I mean, they could be the same. This Smith family just so happens to be from Nottinghamshire. You're kidding. Right? But they're known as the Harris or Harris family. And so according to the House of Names, where they spell it the Hair-Ass family, or Mr. Ass, right? Also interesting how close that is to harass, as in harassment or harassment. It's a Norman name that literally means heir, right? A person who was the son or the ruler of the property upon which he lived. Heir, And so what it says here, it says that this Henry Smith was regicide. And what that means was that he was one of the judges who excommunicated King Charles I after during the English Civil Wars, right? And it's interesting that he doesn't get killed or flee the country after Charles regains the throne, because Charles goes after those judges, right? So maybe not a coincidence there either, right? Because miraculously his life is spared. And it gets better because Henry Smith's mother is the daughter of one Henry Skipworth of Coates, Leicestershire. Right? Unbelievable. And so seeing this, I was like, okay, there has to be some form of nobility to the Skipworth name, right? There just has to be. None of this can be a coincidence, right? And sure enough, right, Skipworth is an ancient Norman name. No. Get out of here. And it's pedigreed out the wazoo. I mean, the family comes out of Yorkshire, where they're granted the sheep farm by William the Conqueror in 1066. I mean, that's a pretty important gig, I would imagine, with how important the wool industry is to these drapers, right? And in fact, the Skipworth family is one of the most distinguished in all of Normandy. And they held a castle at Ambriers, which may have looked like this. I mean, I don't know. This is the only picture of a castle in Ambriers that I could find. They're very close to kings, right? And Charles I actually parties with the Skipworths right on the night before he turns himself over to the Scottish. You know, which is really amazing because it's a Skipworth descendant that condemns his fate, right? And so I'm thinking that this whole affair, right, is about the preservation of bloodlines, right? Because what better way to hide your super noble Skipworth bloodline in history than by casting him as a servant in this whole Mervyn Touche trial of the century drama, right? Any connection to Skipworth nobility would be erased in this way, right? And so if this is really an attempt to hide some form of noble birth, right, and with everything we know about the people coming out of Nottinghamshire, right, and what's going on with the plantation projects of Ulster and America, just maybe this child was spirited away by one of the brothers Poe and planted over in Lute with friends of the hand, you know, maybe friends like the Finnegans, right, and maybe this person's family, and maybe this family descends all the way down to our esteemed President Joe Biden, right? And I'm not saying that's what happened, you know, I'm just illustrating what could be possible. I mean, that baby could have stayed with the Poes and become a pal, right? I mean, who knows? You know, I mean, I don't, right? But I do know that the record points to a hidden Tudor bloodline baby out there, right? And the possibilities of that are endless, right? As are the machinations of the hidden hand. Right, because to top this one off with a cherry, all of these shenanigans, buggery or bloodline or otherwise, took place at Fonthill Gifford, the estate Mervyn Touche called home, right? And that was in Wiltshire. You know what else is in Wiltshire? Stonehenge, right? And the Avebury Circles and Silbury Hill, right? I think it's absolutely amazing. All of this possible bloodline ritual sex magic was happening right in the very pagan heart of ancient Britain, right? This can't be a coincidence. You know, and so all of this comes from a throwaway mention in Edmund Bewley's biography on Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, that is absolutely incredible. And so to close this one out, you know what else they have in Wiltshire? They have Corsham, an underground nuclear bunker with accommodation for 4,000. That cannot be a coincidence. Especially with the common cold unit so close by in Salisbury, right? Birthplace of the coronavirus, as we talked about in the Winter Chicken Dinner episode. Remember, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so until the next one, cheers, guys.